Well, welcome to the Building Podcast. As the largest industry in the UK, construction has an important relationship with government, and government is also our largest client. Today, we're going to look at how we can influence government over and above our simple project demands. We're privileged to be joined by Eddie Hughes, who was the Minister for Housing under the previous government. And Eddie's hopefully going to help us navigate this relationship and tell us just how to make it work for us. Eddie, good afternoon.
Afternoon, Mark.
So Eddie, we normally start by asking you just to sort of say what you are doing at the moment. You've obviously left Parliament after the last election, but you're clearly active within construction. Do you want to tell the listeners what you're up to now and what you're doing?
Well, I am indeed active in construction, but I just wanted to explain very quickly how I got here, because although I was a councillor for 18 years, I was an MP and a minister for 7 years, I've always felt of myself as a builder, basically. I sat in a JCB for the first time when I was 11, and I knew that I wanted to work on a construction site. I ended up passing the 11 plus, first person in my family to go to university, but I did civil engineering so that I could still work with those JCBs and be in the action building stuff. And indeed, to recent times, I've maintained my membership as a member of the Chartered Institute of Building throughout my time as an MP and kept my close links with the construction sector at all times. So now I'm back on the front line, as it were. My first job is going to be supporting the Church of England with their housing ambitions. I'm helping them look at some sites for development and help them work out their protocols to make sure the quality and style of the housing fits with their broader aspirations. So hopefully a combination of some politics and some construction that I'm bringing to bear on the work for them.
Brilliant. Well, it's always good to be talking to a fellow civil engineer, and very pleased you've kept your CIOB membership running all these years, because I think it's really important to stay in contact with such a large industry and how we're working and some of the challenges we're facing. I'm going to take the opportunity of having you on board, Eddie, is just to talk about what the role of government is in construction, because it's more than just the client, isn't it? The government sets the scene, and it'd be useful just to hear from the government's perspective what you think government's role is within the sector.
Well, Mark, I think sometimes people underestimate just how much control the government has over their lives. So it decides at what age or whether you can smoke, it decides how fast you can drive on the road, and it has an incredible impact on the things we can construct, how we construct them, and where we build them. So, for example, one of the roles that I had as housing minister was I was the minister responsible for the building regs. So when we had the Part L interim uplift in the building regs, that stepping stone on the way to the Future Home Standard, I was the minister responsible for the introduction of that. And so when you think about the kind of level of influence that a government minister can have on what is being built and to what standard, I think it's important to appreciate that. And it's important to appreciate that those decisions aren't just arrived at kind of in isolation. The government does a lot of consultation with people before it makes a decision like that. But sometimes the minister isn't necessarily involved in all of that. That'll be done behind the scenes by the civil service. And then the minister is brought in the later stages of it, except in my case, because as somebody who was professionally experienced in this area, I was determined to try to get involved in as much of the preamble as I could, simply because I found it incredibly interesting. But I think we need to consider, because we're at that time where the government is giving some serious consideration to its planning legislation, and again, it will be determining not just what can be built and where, but what designations apply to various bits of land. So the hot topic at the moment is grey belt and describing exactly what that is. And that's going to be really important, I think, to people who are considering planning proposals for the future. Perhaps a piece of land that they thought they couldn't build on, they might now be able to build on. And anything we can do to free up more opportunity for the industry to get on and build is a good thing. But I think conversely, the reverse should be true as well. Where there is an over-regulation or perhaps an unintended consequence of regulation, then the government shouldn't be too big to backtrack and say, actually, we got that wrong. And one of the things I had was I visited a number of building sites where housing developers showed me a bar that they had to put across some windows because of an overly ambitious interpretation of one of the building regs that I'd changed that would stop people running the whole length of the upstairs of the house and throwing themselves through the window. So sometimes it's not just the legislation that it's wrong, but the interpretation of it, and we need to make sure we take heed of what the sector says to us.
So that's really government setting the environment we operate within to be able to bring that. Quite interesting. You're talking there about your knowledge of the industry helping you inform those decisions. I mean, I can certainly say the civil servants I've been lucky enough to work with over the last 20 years have generally been awesome, been very helpful and very knowledgeable, and actually very receptive to industry contributions and ideas. How important is it that the minister has a grounding in what they're trying to be minister of?
Well, I think I was borderline unique. When I got my ministerial folder, the first thing that happens is you get a letter in that folder from the Secretary of State with a list of things that they would like you to focus on. And then they put on the website the full range of your responsibilities. So although I was the Minister for Housing and Homelessness, I was also the Minister for the Building Regs, or for liaison with the Grenfell community in the run up to the 5th anniversary of that tragic fire, and a whole host of other things. And so I read the full list and it felt like it had been tailor-made for me and my experience prior to being in government. But normally the reverse is true. Normally the last thing they want is a kind of professionally competent minister in post, because your decisions are meant to be broadly political. Because, as you just described, we've already got a civil service who are incredibly smart, able, and generally speaking, know their topics inside out and back to front. They can handle all of that detail, and the minister should take decisions based on government policy, based on taking the political temperature of Parliament and the country and things like that. So it is normally the case that professional competence would rule you out of a post, but in my case it felt like, in fact it was kind of amusing because there were a few articles that were in the housing press at the time I was appointed, with people commenting on the fact that it was unusual to find a housing minister who had such specific housing experience. So it's a rarity, but it worked well for me, and which is why I loved the role, and which is why I stepped down from being a minister rather than being sacked. It was lovely to be in control of my own destiny. Yeah. But I felt like I'd already had the opportunity to do the perfect ministerial role for me, and I didn't want to be moved. I apologize to ministers who have had this job, but I use this expression. I didn't want to be moved to be, for example, the Minister for Ministry of Defence Procurement or something like that was just so esoteric. I wouldn't have a clue what I was doing, or any enthusiasm or love of the job, which I really had for my job as a housing minister.
So in that role then, Eddie, did you find that you would spread incredibly thinly over that very wide remit that you had?
Or well,
did you have time to focus on where you needed to be?
In some ways, yes, but in other ways, I think people underestimate just how busy the life of a minister is, and the civil service hate a vacuum. If they see a gap in your diary, they want to fill that with something. So and typically the ministerial day is a very packed one from the minute you arrive to the minute you leave, and then at some point you're allowed to leave the office to head over to Parliament to vote. But then once you're on the estate, once the normal kind of working day is over, let's say 8 to 6, you've then got your ministerial box. So in my case, it wasn't one of those red leather cases that you see, but it was a digital box that was sent to me on my laptop, and the papers for that is very structured box of papers that would include policy documents for your approval, briefing papers for meetings the following day, and then a healthy bunch of correspondence letters from fellow colleagues or other MPs that other people had constructed an answer to, and you had to sign off. So it would take me, on average, perhaps 2.5 hours every evening to do my box. So you are kind of, they've got, I don't know, maybe a 12 or 13-hour working day to pack in. And so you can cover a lot of that responsibility in that time. And then, of course, obviously, lots of working weekends. I tell you, I couldn't believe it. Everything, the only time everything genuinely switched off was for 4 or 5 days over Christmas. And it was a thing of beauty.
Yeah, well, you probably earned a good rest by then, I suspect. I presume you've got some constituency work to do on top of all of that. So that's
that's true. That's true. Well, I tell you what, not being an MP now, it feels really liberating. Of course, I wish I'd won, but I'm certainly enjoying having some more time to myself and to spend with my wife.
You'll be able to recharge the batteries for the next round then.
Indeed.
So, Eddie, I mean, one of the things which I think worries us in the construction industry is that while we're the largest single industry in the UK, we don't think we're treated particularly well by government, because we get so many different construction ministers in such a short period of time. They seem to have revolving door coming in as a construction minister. Is there any reason? Does that signify how low down the pecking order we are as an industry, or is that just because once you've done construction, you can go on and become a senior minister somewhere?
Well, I would say, don't be so bold as to think you're special. The average life expectancy, I think, of a minister in the 2019 and subsequent years was 8 months. That wasn't a construction minister. That was a minister full stop. So I think in this country we have become too wedded to the idea that if at some point things generally, if the political temperature of the country isn't going the way you want, one of the ways to reset the narrative is to just shuffle the deck in terms of the ministers and their appointments. And also that gives some motivation to MPs in Parliament who think they need to behave in a particular way or work particularly hard in order to be considered for preferment. So I don't think, sadly, the construction role in government is unique. We have managed to work our way. In fact, so much so that I think David Cameron made a remark about the fact that we were changing ministers as often, transport ministers as often as trains were arriving in Euston. Although during his period of government, he really did try to limit the amount of reshuffles to give people the opportunity to bed in. And I think it would be interesting to see what Keir Starmer does. But, we did cycle through 3 prime ministers in pretty quick succession. And so it was obvious that you were going to have reshuffles aligned with that. I'm hoping that one thing the Labour government does bring now is this period of stability where we stick with the same prime minister and hopefully broadly with the same ministerial team, because it does take quite some time to familiarise yourself with the brief and to just get into the rhythm of a new department and the challenges that are within it. So for the construction industry, for health, for education, for everybody, a more settled outlook for the years ahead would be very, very welcome.
Brilliant. Well, it's hallelujah to that, because we might get some proper work in the industry, because I think there's some strategic work that certainly needs to be done. I mean, on that theme though, Eddie, I mean, the role of politicians, you sort of touched on it previously, but perhaps you'd like to say a little bit more about the role of politicians within their departments and how they actually operate, because they have a slightly different role from the civil servants that are there to do the work, if you like. You want to say a little bit more about why they're positioned there and what their expectations of that position are?
Well, yes, indeed. So, I mean, I guess the first point is that all governments will be elected on a manifesto, and therefore it's the minister's job to make sure those things are delivered. But one of the things that I would say to anybody listening to this is that engagement with your local MP is incredibly important. And we're at a point now in the parliamentary cycle where we've got, I think, 325 of the MPs currently sitting on the benches were only elected in July of this year. So they're new to it. They're still finding their way around the parliamentary estate and around the parliamentary process. Now is a great time to be engaging with them. And I say that because, of course, it's the minister's job to deliver the manifesto commitments. But within that, there's a broad range of opportunity for interpretation and nuance. And whilst organisations like the NFB and so on will have the opportunity occasionally to sit down around the table with a minister, your local MP will have the opportunity to bump into that minister in the voting lobby, in the tea room, in the restaurants, all the time. And so it is really important, because they will take heed of what they're hearing from their colleagues in terms of understanding what are the priorities for the country. That will be the conduit through which a good chunk of information comes to them. And so I think it's really important that people engage as often as and actively as they can with their local MP to let them understand what is their priority, because it is no good doing that just at the point that legislation comes into the headlines. So, for example, obviously, we've got planning legislation is a significant thing at the moment. There's been a consultation period, and anybody in the sector who has not engaged with that process because they think it's not worth engaging because nothing ever happens, they've missed an opportunity to shape the thinking of the minister and to set the kind of direction of travel for that policy, because there is always some opportunity for interpretation. But generally speaking, that's the minister's job, and you spend an awful lot of your time in roundtable meetings trying to absorb the views of people on both sides of any argument to understand that you've got a balanced perspective and you know the possible unintended consequences of your actions in advance rather than after you've introduced the legislation. So I would urge anybody listening, permanent dialogue with your MP is vital, because you never know, one day your MP might go on to become a minister or even the Prime Minister.
Well, yes, and there's some good advice there. So, I mean, we're really talking about local MPs, because I think a lot of MPs will only talk to their constituents,
yes,
rather
indeed,
than people from outside their constituencies. So,
yeah.
You have to go through your local MP, and presumably.
Well, I say that, Mark, that there are some exceptions to that, okay. I would say. So if I just run through very quickly a couple of the things that happen in Parliament, just so people understand how the rhythm of it works. So for starters, we have every day starts with questions to a department. So that's on a 5-week cycle. So MPs have the opportunity to question ministers at the dispatch box. Now, if you have had some discussion with your local MP, you can kind of influence any question that they might ask in the chamber. But some of the stuff that happens in Parliament isn't on the telly and isn't in the chamber, and that's through what I think is a vital process, the all-party parliamentary group. So there are, at any given time, there might be between 300 and 500 of these. And if there is MPs who sit on, for example, the all-party parliamentary group for construction or housing, then you might have the opportunity to speak to somebody who isn't your MP, but because they are chairing one of those all-party parliamentary groups, to try to get your view across to them.
Right. Okay. So good place to feed in and to feed in ideas and solutions.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, we talk about consistency, and I think we've talked about this in a previous meeting around the role of the House of Lords, which has a long-term view on some of these things and has some very long-term standing committees looking at some of the more detailed roles. Does the parliamentary committees from the House of Commons take note of these committees from the House of Lords?
Well, if I give you one example that is particularly dear to me. So I chaired the all-party, it's a very grand title, the all-party parliamentary group for excellence in the built environment. And at that time, we were doing some work on the idea of a new homes ombudsman. Because I had come up with this idea at this point that you had more rights as a purchaser when you bought an electric kettle than if you bought a house. And so we needed to introduce some sort of balance to the system. And my co-chair on that all-party parliamentary group was Lord Best. And he is without doubt one of the most experienced and knowledgeable housing people in Parliament. And I think it is, people don't understand often just the brilliance and the experience and, you know, commercial and industry expertise that sits within the House of Lords, and the fact that sometimes I say this as somebody who might have been guilty of it myself occasionally. MPs sometimes have to play for the social media clicks, and they have to play a political game that's going to hopefully allow them more chance of being elected again at some point in the future. None of that burden sits on the members of the House of Lords. Their job is to just do the right thing all the time, and frequently they will stick to just commenting on things that they have, areas that they have a particular expertise in, whereas sometimes in Parliament we have to be more generalist, and we occasionally drift into topics where we are perhaps not as expert as we would like to think we are. So I think the value of the House of Lords is sometimes less than it should be, because people don't fully appreciate the brilliant ability of the people who constitute it, and they don't understand its role in terms of as a secondary reforming chamber, sometimes saying to the government, we think you've got this wrong, or we think you could do this better, try again, and we'll have a look at it for you. So an invaluable part of our political system, I think.
Yeah. Well, and often doesn't take the limelight at all, but clearly doing a bit of quarterbacking for everybody, which is probably good news.
Absolutely.
One of the challenges we have in our industry is that we've got an enormous number of trade federations. I think the first government construction advisor said there were something like 267 different trade federations within the representing construction. Clearly far too many. When we're making representations to government, is quantity better than quality, or how is there any benefits in trying to amalgamate these trade federations into a smaller number, so it's more important to be able to get to government? How does government react to that?
No, that's a very good point. In as much as, if it were down to me, if I was advising, I would say it's completely legitimate that number exists, because clearly the civil engineers will have a completely different view to, builders more generally, or whoever else. It's a huge spectrum of activity that falls under the construction umbrella, so it's not surprising. However, I think they should find, or there should be a format through which they agree a limited number of absolute asks of the government, so that they are speaking with one voice. Because the other problem that you've got is the bandwidth of government to be able to listen to the demands that the sector might have at any one point is really quite narrow. And that's because they've got so many other things that they are going to be legislating on or giving consideration to. And so if the sector was somehow to find a route where they could agree broadly on a smaller number of asks of government, I think that would be incredibly helpful. So if I took for instance, if there were concerns broadly across the sector as to how the apprenticeship levy is applied or is used, then they should be speaking as one voice. It's no good coming to the minister with 200 different versions of how you'd like something like that to be operated in the future or to be reformed. Whereas if you had all of those people coming with 3 asks or 3 suggestions, then you're giving the minister and the government machine something that's much easier for them to understand and work with. So yes, it is difficult, but less is more, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've often wondered whether divide and rule was a very useful technique for government within our industry, and having a large number of trade federations that they could listen to at any one time, who might have vastly different views about certain things, might be quite helpful, because then you may never be wrong in those circumstances. But that might be just a little too cynical for today's conversation. I suppose just moving on. I mean, that communication is there any sort of tidbits on how we best communicate with government? Do we need to give them answers rather than being critical all the time? Do we need to give them solutions to the problems they're creating? Do we need to just point out? I don't know. How do ministers best respond to representation?
Well, I would say perhaps a bit of everything. And let's go back. I'm desperate during the course of our discussion to champion the power and benefit of the backbencher MP in this story and their role. And so if we talk about them again a little bit first, and the point that I made about the fact that occasionally MPs need to do that social media stuff, it feels to me that people in construction have got that great opportunity to offer the high-vis photo op, and to bring in the local MP across such a broad range of topics that would go from net zero to education needs, or and beyond, to finance and so on. And so it would be possible to bring in your MP on a kind of more regular basis than people might appreciate, and talk to them about a different element of the challenges of the construction sector at one time, not least because they will be taking that information then and going to separate MPs. So if one opportunity you're talking about planning concerns, and another opportunity they can then speak to one of the ministers responsible for planning. The next time it might be the application of VAT on certain construction products, and they'll speak to a Treasury minister. And then again, to speaking about I don't know, general professional qualifications, they'll be speaking to an education minister. So it's no bad thing to keep bringing them back to site and to remind them about the range of challenges that exist, and to leave them to then go and do the lobbying on your behalf. But the second thing I would say is show not tell is really powerful. So for me, for example, I've been speaking to Barrett's recently about some of their construction challenges, and about the idea that they're building housing developments now that have no gas supply. And so they are trying to meet in advance of it's actually being signed off the Future Home Standard, and doing some testing about post-occupancy performance levels and things like that. And the fact that you can bring somebody to the site and show them an actual building and say, Minister, these are the sort of things that you're trying to achieve. This is your expectation for the legislation you're going to be bringing in. Just let me explain to you some of the challenges we've had arriving at this point, or let me explain to you some of the challenges that the people who now occupy these homes, who are your voters, will have coming to terms with the net zero technology that will be used in their house in the future. The idea that you might not be able to dry your wet washing on the radiators anymore because the ambient temperature is going to be lower, and so on. So the show not tell, I think, is a great way of the sector actually informing people of the consequences of their legislative actions.
Brilliant. And I mean, I suppose the last question around that representation: do people whose local MPs are not members of the ruling party, so those who don't have a Labour member of Parliament, are they disenfranchised from making those contributions, or do ministers listen to members of Parliament from whichever background and party they belong to?
I think one of the terrible fallacies is this idea that we don't get on across the chamber, because the natural kind of way that we operate is a bit confrontational, a bit tribal for what happens in the chamber, whereas actually most of the good stuff most of the good work isn't done in the chamber at all. It's done on select committees where you have cross-party MPs working very effectively together. It's done on all-party parliamentary groups where you have cross-party MPs working together. So the opportunity for an MP of any political colour to feed into the system and to inform either through discussions that they have with other Labour MPs who then in turn speak to ministers. But I would say every MP, regardless of your affiliation, is as valid a person to work with because they will have routes through to influencing ministers one way or another. It might not be quite the same. It won't, they won't be sitting down and having breakfast with the minister, but they will have an opportunity to catch them at various points. So it's completely valid regardless.
Brilliant. Well, Eddie, I'm really grateful for the time you've had. I'm going to ask you one final question, which is a bit of an open-ender. Politicians have had a bad press over the years, and they're often on the list of attractive careers to follow, fairly near the bottom. But clearly, they're a vital piece of any democracy. How should our industry big up and make politicians and demonstrate their value to our industry? How should we go about ensuring that the wills and wishes of our industry are represented in the legislation that comes through, which has to go through politicians?
I'll come back to my press for more engagement. I would say love your legislator. You've got to. There's a bit sounds slightly Americanism, but just by engaging more, because generally speaking, people don't know their MP. But either constituency or businesses don't know their MP, and taking a bit more time to get to know them and to understand their challenges and ambitions and aspirations for their constituents goes a long way, and then gives you the opportunity to speak from knowledge about an MP. So if and in the future somebody says, well, politicians are all a waste of time, there's no point engaging with them, if you've actually spoken to one, if you've worked with one, if they've achieved something for you, then you're going to be an ambassador for that MP in the future and speak to others and say, no, I spoke to this Eddie Hughes bloke, he's a good guy, he gets things done, he's the type of guy that you need to engage with, and maybe you should get to know them. So and as I say, in my case, I had the opportunity, 3 things that I championed as a backbench MP, I ended up subsequently delivering as the minister responsible for it. So you never know, that engagement might pay dividends for you.
Very satisfying, I'm sure. Eddie, it's been an absolute pleasure to have a canter through how government works with the industry and how industry needs to contact and relate to government. It's obviously a two-way process, and I hope we've managed to dispel a few myths for our listeners as to how things work and how things should work. But it's been a very great pleasure talking to you, and thank you for your time today.
You're doing great work, Mark. Thank you.